Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to This Is Me Attitude podcast, where it's all about helping you start or grow your relationship with the Lord. I'm your host, Rachel Nelson, a Christ follower who has learned time and time again, following the Lord isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. Join me and my guests as we talk about our own relationships with the Lord in every area of life, including entrepreneurship, motherhood, prayer life, and more. My goal is you will learn something new to implement in your own relationship with the Lord and leave here saying, "This is me, a uniquely created, loved daughter of God." Are you a Christian entrepreneur? Do you agree with what is being shared here on This Is Me Attitude podcast? Do you have a product or service you want the world to know about? If you said yes to any of these questions, being a sponsor for the show might be the perfect fit for you. What's included in being a sponsor is a spot just like this in the show of 30 seconds worth of time showing how great your product or service is. Have your info shared on my website, have your contact info shared in that episode's description and the email sent out, and me knowing about your business and connecting you with others while I continue to network for the podcast. For more information on being a sponsor for the show, email me today at thisismecommunity@gmail.com. Welcome back to This Is Me Attitude podcast. I am so excited to say I have a bonus episode for everyone to tune into, and it's a little bit different of a layout, structure, and topic that we're talking about today, as we will also be talking about faith. This is the first time we've had two guest speakers on the show at once, and I'm very excited about that. So I'd like to welcome to the show Dan Baker and Roger Volk. Hopefully I just pronounced both of your names fully correctly. Perfect, sorry. And realize that I didn't ask before we started recording, but I'll keep going. And we connected via social media, which if you've listened to the show a few times, that's a pretty popular way I've met a lot of guest speakers. I definitely think that it's God working in just the different connections, because the biggest way that I connected with both of these guys is they are veterans, and I come from a family of multiple different veterans. My husband was in the Marines, always considered a Marine. I've been corrected on that multiple times. My brother is actually an active Air Force right now, stationed in California. So this topic in general is very near and dear to my heart. And I know that it's basically a completely different world for you that have been in service and that are active duty now. So I'm really excited to get the perspective from two believers and also veterans in that. So without further ado, I will read both of their bios, and I'm pretty excited for this because you can tell within their bios they've been literally all over the world. Also, heads up, they're a little bit longer bios than I usually like to read, but I think it's definitely worth it. Dan is, after growing up in an Army family, he spent over 20 years in the U.S. Army from the late 1990s into the teens. Stationed in both the U.S. and Europe, he held positions ranging from lowly infantry rifleman to platoon sergeant, and from overworked drill sergeant to relentlessly bored observer controller. A lover of history, travel, and food, Dan appreciated the Army's willingness to send him to such fascinating places as Fort Irwin, California, and Fort Drum, New York, where, in his opinion, there is little notable history. Travel is a burden, and the food is mostly uninspiring. Looking back fondly on his time in Europe, he has developed a great appreciation for the brewmasters of Germany, the beaches of Dalmatian coast, hopefully I said that right too, and the often misunderstood multicultural people of Switzerland. He finds no redeeming qualities in the mosquito-infested canals of Venice, nor in overcrowded Paris, and the often overly self-important French population in general. After spending several years in Afghanistan, Dan swore that upon retirement he would never be clean shaven again and never ever take a hot shower for granted. Now happily retired, Dan greatly enjoys sitting by the fireplace, enjoying the fine distilled exports of Scotland, and turning the pages of an actual book. Did I do okay in introducing you, Dan?
Did wonderfully.
Apologies to your French audience.
I apologize for nothing. Not
Awesome.
not you,
And,
doofus, her.
and to fully introduce Roger, he's an Army brat, grew up in exotic areas such as El Paso, Texas, West Germany, Colorado Springs, Colorado, and Fayetteville. Am I saying that correctly?
Fayetteville, yeah.
Fayetteville, okay, North Carolina. After graduating from high school, he attended East Carolina University, known in some circles as the Harvard of Eastern North Carolina. He entered the Army in 2004 as a field art and took a few round trips to Iraq and Afghanistan. As was the fashion at the time, in fact, most of Roger's career consisted of traveling to many countries while his earthly possessions remained in storage in Fayetteville. He enjoyed most of his overseas adventures, but will die a happy man if he never has to experience another Hindu or Mediterranean winter. Is that how you
Yeah.
say it?
Yeah, Hindu
Mediterranean?
Kush or
Manchurian.
yeah,
Manchurian.
Manchurian.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you. He is happily married and has more children than he can handle. He was last seen driving a multitude of children to youth group, gymnastics, baseball, band, cross country practice. And Roger would love to have hobbies someday like canoeing, fishing, camping, reading, or simply sitting on his couch undisturbed for more than 10 minutes. Without further ado, welcome to the show, guys.
What are hobbies?
I,
Roger
I
can
would,
add a new one to the list because now he's got one doing rock climbing.
Rock climbing, yep.
oh, wow.
Add it to the list.
Yep.
Fantastic. So, just out of curiosity, since you have it in there, how many kiddos do you have?
So I have four,
Four?
ranging from almost 14 to I have two that are 8 right now.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
And Dan, do you have any kids? I don't remember if we said that
I
before.
do. I have two. They are grown. They are both in their 20s.
Awesome. So, you're on the other end of it. That's pretty cool.
Oh, I got
Um,
started early.
Gotcha. Well, I'm on the way opposite end of all of these guys. I am expecting my first baby at the end of January. So we were actually talking about that before recording. And listeners, I know that I've mentioned that in other episodes. So also, if it sounds like I'm out of breath, it's literally because I'm out of breath because baby is trying to take all of it. And with that, I will dive right into the first question of when and how did you become a Christian?
Daniel, you want to lead?
Sure. I grew up in a religious family. We went to church at least once a week, sometimes twice a week. We were very involved in the church with like as kids, we were involved in the Awana program and things like that. And I don't remember how old I was when I was baptized, but I was very young. And the only thing I really remember is I thought the guy was trying to kill me because I was little, but I didn't get saved really until I don't know, 13, 14. Um, I had some questions, and there was a pastor at the church at the time who who I was really fond of, and he sat me down and talked to me and answered all my questions, and that led to a series of conversations, and then a few weeks later, it was a done deal.
Oh, that's awesome. Roger, do you want to explain your coming to Jesus story?
Yeah, sure. So again, two Christian parents, so grew up in a Christian house back in the 80s, when I was a kid. My parents were initially they were Methodist. So I would say really we were very culturally Christian at the time. So kind
Mhm.
of lukewarm, wishy-washy, not to take a dig at any Methodists, but that's just kind of how it was. Go to
Mhm.
church, sing songs, whatever, go home, and there was just something that we did on Sundays. And then in the early 90s, we moved to Colorado and moved into a, newly built neighborhood out there on the prairie in Colorado Springs. And like a week or so after we moved into the house, they started breaking ground just down the road on the massive Focus on the Family campus that's there in Colorado Springs for anybody that knows about that they built back in, I want to say 1990. And my parents really just caught fire for the Lord. We started going to a more evangelical style kind of
Mhm.
non-denominational church, and my parents just totally caught fire. So in the early 90s, my dad retired from the Army, and then we moved back here to North Carolina, and it was pretty much cruising from then. So really, to answer your question, I was same as Dan. I was probably about 13, 14 years old when I really kind of put it all together and determined that this was the life that I wanted to take as well. So we were at a church, kind of like youth camp, that was up on the North Carolina
Mhm.
Virginia border. That during summertime, kind of like a retreat kind of thing. And it was there where I made that decision. I wanted to wait to get baptized until I came home so my parents could be
Oh,
present for that.
cool.
So we had our youth pastor go ahead and baptize me there in our church on a Sunday morning. So yeah, maybe 14 years old, something like that.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. Thank you for
Yeah.
both sharing your perspectives on that because one, for me personally, I always think it's cool to see different stories and how people have come to know the Lord because each person's walk with the Lord is so different. And especially what you were saying, Dan, of being baptized earlier on and then not fully understanding until later. That's definitely how I came to God as well. And that I think is way more common than like what the average church would like to say or really talks about because there's a lot of times that we as Christians are baptized as like little kids and not knowing, oh, this is just what mom and dad tell us to do. And I don't say that for listeners. If you are a parent that has done that for your child, like you're doing everything the best that you can and you're just trying to set them up for success. And I'm not saying it's anything against you on that, but it is different when they, as their own person, come to the Lord and have that relationship with them. And especially as a teenager, like that's already a hard season of life as it is. So then
Yeah.
being able to have God with you and that is, I think, really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't really let my 13-year-old, she wanted to get baptized much younger.
Mm.
And, this was her father I wouldn't let her get baptized until she turned 13 because I wanted her to know what she was getting into. This is
Yeah.
you were dying of self and you were being, born again into something this is something that you will take with you for the rest of your life. And I want you to know what you're getting into.
I definitely see your perspective in that. And I think that's a really smart thing to say of like, do you fully understand what this is? Because it's not just a going to the grocery store thing. It's a very important
Right.
aspect to each believer's life. And I again, not having my own experience of being a parent quite yet, but I understand that there is different ways of going about things and that each parent and each child's relationship is different in that as well and is walking with the Lord.
Well, it's the parable of the seeds and the ground they fall upon, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
ones that fall on the rocks and a hard surface don't grow because it's too difficult. The ones that fall in the thorns have no light, and they're being strangled by everything around them. But the ones that fall on fertile ground, which is essentially the age of understanding, that's the one that grows and blossoms.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. That's a really good parallel to it. And just to quote scripture exactly, because it's obviously from scripture. And that's one of my biggest goals in the podcast is to lead people back to read their Bibles, because I will never be able to say that I can quote all of the Bible or like really many verses of it. So I don't want to have it misstrued or misunderstood by any means. Where have you seen God work the most in your life?
Raj, you want to take this one first?
Sure. So for me, this is obviously it's deeply personal. So my first deployment in Afghanistan was a rough one. I definitely saw some things and had to do some things that most people shouldn't have to do. And I definitely suffered from PTSD for really initially for that first year. So after that first deployment was pretty bad. You kind of learn how to live with it a little bit. But I definitely had some years where I kind of drifted. My college years prior to when I came into the Army. I went to college prior, and then my first couple of years with some deployments. I never stopped believing. Like I always knew Christ was there. I knew God was there, but it's hard to balance kind of what we call the warrior ethos on the Army side. I know all the services are a little bit different, but it's kind of that, you take a lot on yourself personally. It's that, be that servant leader, that warrior leader, that, resiliency, toughness, mental toughness, physical toughness. The Army trains you to do all of these things. And a lot of they're really great tools and skills, but it's still very secular because they're leaving out a very crucial fulcrum in the entire thing. And that's that all of this really ultimately depends on God.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of had these years where I kind of drifted and was, kind of very, what I like to call fleshy, when Paul talks about being of the flesh, right? Where I was trying to take on all this on my shoulders, and probably pride and ego would have been some of the driving factors behind that as well. And it really wasn't until I got, met my now wife, and started dating her, and seeing kind of another perspective on things, that's kind of when I came back to my faith in a much more serious way. So I never really looked back after, after we got married, just, and then seeing the woman and mother that she is. And yeah, and then we can get into a whole other thing with parenthood, but
Well,
yeah.
that's awesome, and kudos to your wife for bringing you back to the Lord and just
Yeah.
the growth in the family. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Dan, would you like to share your story?
Sure. I went through some really bad years in the early 2000s where my personal life imploded and I was deploying a lot and it wasn't easy. There was some things going on in Afghanistan that weren't great and lost some people, lost some friends, and everything back home was on fire as well. And I just, the whole why me, God,
Mm-hmm.
falling into that falling into that doubt. And it took years to climb out of that hole little by little, but you start putting things together, I guess. You start seeing, well, why not me instead of why me? And if if the answer to that is because it wasn't your time, then what am I doing with the time that this extra time that I have?
Mm-hmm.
Am I being grateful and appreciative for this time that I have now? Or am I just staying in that same hole and not doing anything with it? And so I started to really climb out of that little by little by little. And with family and friends, I was able to do that. And so every day, the first thing that I thank God for is being here,
Yeah.
because that could certainly not be true.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much to both of you for really just pulling back the curtain and sharing one, the side of your faith journey as just individuals, but then also to bring in the aspects that you were serving the country and how that looks different compared to somebody that wouldn't. And I think that's a really good perspective for the listeners to hear because it's, again, like I said in the beginning, it's not a normal conversation to hear on this or on this podcast, and I just think it's beneficial for sure. Just the vulnerability I don't take for granted, and just appreciate that you guys are willing to do that because I know that it's not easy to be like, here's all of the yuck, here you go. And that's definitely been, I've had other guest speakers do that as well, and it always just really surprises me of how comfortable people are to talk to me.
Yeah.
So listeners, I hope that you are taking that in as well.
Well, I think Dan might be, he can speak for himself on this, but it took me a very long time to get to the point where I was comfortable about talking about these things.
Yeah. Yeah. Even today, there's still some stuff that I'm not comfortable talking about.
Yeah.
It's understandable.
Not that I'm burying anything down deep like some of our, World War II and Vietnam and Korean veterans or anything like that, but it's just, you know, talking about it, talking about certain events, certain places, certain things. It's just not beneficial for myself or, you know, other people. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's completely understandable. And um, it's a part of your story and part of how you got to be where you're at today. And just the fact that you mentioned of saying being thankful for each day every morning, like I think every single human on the face of the planet can start their day with that because just the fact that we have breath in our lungs for another day from God is can be considered a miracle. And regardless if you've been in the military or not in the military or have had all of the different things happen in your life, it's just a good reminder of like, oh, like everything else is so crazy busy in my life. Well, I can start with just the fact that I woke up today. Like that's good. So we're
Yeah.
starting off.
Not just that, but I mean, waking up, yes, being granted another day, but then being granted a day on this incredible, incredible place that we call Earth. I mean, if people actually took the time to travel rather than just looking at, pictures on the internet or videos on the internet and actually seeing these things in person for themselves, they'd be blown away by just the majesty that God has created for us.
That's so cool. I am definitely living through you guys when I was reading the bios because I have not been outside of the US yet in my life. And that's one of my goals is to be able to travel and eventually hopefully travel with family and all of the things because I definitely can imagine that you just have stories upon stories of the different areas that you've been in and just the different cultures and all of it in between.
Well, let's talk about France, shall we?
Dan would have you believe that he's Indiana Jones.
No, I am certainly not Indiana Jones. Certainly not. But I have been to some really cool places. I mean, even places in Afghanistan, there were times when I would, look around and be like, this place is amazing.
Are you a business owner? Do you know the importance of an email list? Are you currently on the This Is Me Attitude podcast email list and love getting them weekly? Being the one that sends them out, I truly hope you find value in each and every one, just like finding value in each and every one of these episodes. If you're ready to create your own email list in an easy format with multiple features, the ability to send unlimited amounts of emails, and more, AWeber Email is for you. I have an affiliate link you can find in today's show notes. Having an email list has helped me to connect with so many more listeners, and AWeber makes it simple with safe templates and more. Click the link below and get started in building your email list today. We're going to switch gears just a little bit and talk about their podcast. And that's actually, again, how we connected is we both found out we were podcast hosts. And my question for you guys is, has your walk with the Lord affected or played a role in building your podcast? And then can you explain the podcast a little bit to the listeners? And whoever would like to take it.
Yes. We'll answer that reverse order. So we started the podcast because we wanted to give a voice to veterans to tell their stories of service, because at the time we hatched this idea, we thought it was a woefully underserved market. And once we started peeling the layers back, we realized there actually are an awful lot of other people that are out there really doing some great spade work on this. So we're not alone, but there's a lot of other veteran type podcasts that are what we like to call the bro podcasts. And we're kind of, tongue in cheek calling it that. We didn't want this to be a frat party. We are creating something for posterity that veterans can have for their kids, their grandkids, and beyond. It also is a great sounding board for them to just, if you want to call it catharsis, to just discuss things and get it off their chest that they wouldn't necessarily discuss with non-veterans. And I know you said your husband, I'll use the present tense, is a Marine. He would agree that there's just certain things that it's easier to open up about if you're talking to another veteran. What did I leave out, Dan?
No, that's pretty much it. There is a skewed view of the military in the civilian conscious, and I don't think it's willful, but there's, the Air Force flies planes, the Navy sails on ships, things like that. Well, that's true, but that's not everything. That's not even 10%,
Wow.
So there are so many other amazing people doing amazing things throughout all the services that you'll never hear about, because the people that you see in the news or see in the media or writing books or even in movies and TV shows, right? There's the two demographics that you see. There's the super ultra cool guy, or there's the veteran with the PTSD so bad that he's robbing a bank to pay for his daughter's, chemotherapy because the VA is, letting him down. I'm not saying that those people don't exist. Obviously they do. But that leaves out so many people. So we wanted to give a voice to all the veterans to talk about their service, whether it was for 3 years or 20 years or 30 years, to just talk to other veterans. That's essentially what it is. Just veterans talking to veterans.
And so the first half of your question was about, our faith. And when we were hatching this idea, we did kind of bat around whether we were going to make this an, explicitly or overtly a ministry, capital M ministry.
Mm-hmm.
And we actually decided that we would make this a little more covert. So we like to match the intensity of our guests. So if they're a non-believer, we're not going to necessarily proselytize to them during the episode, although we do talk before and after the camera starts rolling. However, we have had several guests that want to come on, and if they want to discuss their faith, then Dan and we're prepared to do that with them. So we figured it would be more effective if we were a little more, sly serpents and as innocent as doves on the whole thing. There you go.
Awesome.
So does that make sense, Rachel?
Yeah, no, it definitely does.
Okay.
I just want to make sure I wasn't cutting either of you off. And I don't know if either of you mentioned the name of the podcast.
Oh, Tracer Burnout.
Perfect.
There we go.
For me personally, as everyone knows is listening, I'm obviously not a veteran, but I have listened to bits and pieces of their episodes, and I think it's really insightful and just, I don't know if exciting is the right word to use, but are cool in hearing people's stories and just seeing, again, like pulling back that curtain of this is actually what happened. Obviously, a lot of things that happen while you're at war, while the country's at war, or different things like that isn't fun to talk about or like fun things, but I think it is good for someone like me that just knows people that have been in service but doesn't know the ins and outs of it to actually understand it a little bit more, and just being useful for the common citizen, because obviously there's a reason that we have the military and that all the different aspects of that, and it's a big industry in itself. I don't even know if you can very much say industry, if that's the correct terminology or not, but and I also like how you guys brought in the aspect of faith, and I really thought about that before launching the show, and how that is, as just both of you are talking, like it's very well known that you have both read the Bible and things like that and have faith in your life. And I think that's exciting to be able to have the background of that and still move forward in something that really God has called you to do by the sounds of it.
We wanted to show that there was more to service than just what you see in media or on the broadcasts. We've got veterans that talk about their trauma from Vietnam. We've got veterans talking about or making comparisons between food on an aircraft carrier and food on a cruise ship. Yeah, I mean
they're remarkably similar.
I mean, the veterans that we talk to, they all have similarities, of course, because they're all in service, but they come from so many different backgrounds. They have so many different reasons for joining, so many different reasons for choosing the service that they did. Mm-hmm. Some of them have no service in their background whatsoever, like their family background. Some of them have 7 generations in service.
Oh, wow.
Going all the way back. I mean, and then what they do with, the bulk of the show is obviously their time in uniform. But then we also touch on what they've utilized from their time in service afterward, like different, whether it's coping skills or actual like training that they received that they then used in the civilian market to get a job, or resiliency or leadership tools, tips, things like that. There is so much, and I mean we don't necessarily have a time limit that we sit down with these veterans. Some episodes are only about an hour, and some are 3.5.
We have a 3.5-hour, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, knowing how the back end of podcasting works, I give you guys credit for that.
Yeah, but it's their story, and you want them to be able to tell it in whichever way they want. And unfortunately, it doesn't matter how long the episode is. You're never going to get the whole story, because it's just even if you only did 3 or 4 years in a 2-hour episode, you're not going to be able to cover everything. Yeah. I mean, that was 3-4 years of your life summarized into 2 hours. That's not everything, but it is an insight for people who don't have any connection to the military, for them to show them different aspects of service.
And we're trying very hard to make this palatable to a, we'll say civilian audience who are not necessarily grounded in military life. So, that's why we keep saying we're not a bro podcast, which again, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, we listened to a few of them. They're good for what they are, but we're trying to make this as palatable, widespread as possible.
Gotcha. No, I definitely think that you're achieving that in what I've listened to, and just from, again, the perspective that I have, it's insightful for me, and I think that it's definitely showing the stories. And for listeners as well, I very much recommend you go listen to their show and just getting the different perspectives, because even if you don't have military background in your family or veterans, I'm sure that you know somebody that has a family member or in some way or capacity is linked to some branch of the military. But I really like the perspective, and I honestly could like sit here and ask like a bunch of different questions on it because it's just intriguing to me. But with that, if you guys haven't, I know you mentioned a little bit, but is there a specific vision or like 5-year plan or like some sort of plan that you guys have for the podcast?
You are the second person to ask us about that today.
Yeah, that's
Oh,
true.
wow.
Um, but yes, there is a plan. We do have bigger plans for this.
Schemes,
Uh,
if you will. Yes.
yes, schemes and machinations, but we're kind of keeping those under our hat for now. But
Gotcha.
we do have plans for the podcast to grow, and then we want to branch off. I mean, keep the podcast going, of course, because that's our primary focus. But then we also want to branch off into some other things for the veteran community.
Oh, that's awesome. And it definitely sounds like the podcast can just be like you said, the starting point and being able
Yeah.
to reach
The
into the
flagship.
different aspects. With all of the different things that we've mentioned today so far, what would you like the listeners to get out of our conversation?
We, we've talked about this a little bit already. Why do we start this thing? It's to us, it's about human interest. We're trying to, I'm going to use a word, I'm using the air quotes here for anybody that's listening. We're trying to humanize, our veterans, right? Because Dan talked about it already, the stereotypes that exist. The military is large, yes, that is true. But if you look at it on like gross, it's actually smaller. I'd have to run the numbers, but it's generally speaking, it's smaller than it's been really for decades. When you have the ebb and flow, we have drawdowns, and then we increase and drawdowns. After the Cold War was over, we had a drawdown. So I mean, it ebbs and flows. That's historical. So we're kind of a low point right now, and then on top of that, we've had some of the recruiting issues, which is a whole other discussion. So there are fewer people serving now than there has been in the past. And that means that there's going to be more and more people who are not connected to the military in any way. So, what we're really trying to do is show people that your neighbors or your second cousin that you hardly know, that they're just normal people too. I miss anything, Dan?
Um, that's a pretty good summation, but it's also about preserving the stories for the families.
Yeah.
Um, and that's one reason why we have not just the audio format, but then also the video format as well, is so that, sadly, some of the Vietnam veterans that we've spoken to will not be here in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. But they have families. So when they talk about, you know, Grandpa Bill or, whoever, well, you never met him, but here is a 2-hour recording of him talking about his time in the Navy, and there's pictures in there too. So you can actually hear his voice, you can see him talking about it, and you can see pictures of him when he was, a young 20 something,
When he
you
had
know,
hair.
when he had hair, you know. So it's preserving that history for those families as well, especially in this day and age where people don't write letters anymore.
Mm-hmm.
People delete old emails. People, we Roger and I have joked about this before. We are reverting back to hieroglyphics, where we don't even text messages anymore. We just text symbols to communicate what we're saying.
Pictures,
So
good.
yeah. So actually preserving those memories of those veterans in their own words for future generations is very important for
Yeah.
for the families, but then also for the civilian populace, so that they can hopefully learn something from those experiences.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and kind of the romantic in me too. this is a passion project for us for on several levels of which we've discussed. But another thing is just there's so much dreck out there, particularly on the internet. So we're working so hard to put something good and wholesome together. We're serving these other veterans in this thing that we're doing, and by extension, by loving and serving others, we're attempting to emulate Christ. So that's again part of our covert ministry, right? But we're just trying to make something good because there's just so much garbage out there. So that's kind of the romantic in me, I suppose.
No, I can completely relate to that and just this show and trying to show up and really show the different stories of people and how God has worked in their life and how he's
Yeah.
still alive and well, because I think especially in the day and age of social media and all the things, you can see the like scripture being posted or this or that, but it can be taken out of context so much. And I think you can also relate that to you guys in your podcast. Yes, maybe someone that isn't in the military can hear one sentence from a veteran and be like, oh, well, I completely understand it now. And it's like, well, not really. You didn't walk the same life. You didn't go through the experiences. And I think that's the same as, oh, I read one verse in the Bible. I understand the whole Bible. Not exactly. That's a little bit bigger perspective. And listeners, I hope that this just encourages you, one, to grow in your faith, and then also to, if you know any veterans that would be awesome guest speakers for the guys, I'm sure that they would love to hear the stories. Or if you want to just learn more about what it's like being in the military, again, their show is definitely the spot you want to go for that. And this is actually a question I didn't have written down for you guys, so I'm kind of throwing you on the spot. But I'm just curious, and I think the listeners would be too, is when did you guys meet and how did it become to where you now work together?
Oh boy, this is going to be a windy road. So so he and I are both we're located in Fayetteville, North Carolina, so southeastern North Carolina. We're near Fort Bragg. It's not really called Fort Liberty. This is all just a bad dream. It's Fort Bragg. For those who don't know, that Fort Bragg was renamed a couple of years ago during the iconoclastic period where we just renamed everything, because a guy in Minnesota died. So my parents' backyard had down in the low ground, there was a cold freshwater creek that ran behind it. And so it was definitely, publicly held land, but because it was adjacent to my parents' house, it was, by God, it was mine, and nobody else was going to ever play in it if I had anything to do with it. And there were these two dorky kids that lived a couple houses up the street who wore Velcro shoes and would always come down and start poaching on my land, taking crayfish out of the waters. And so my sister and I, in Lord of the Flies fashion, would put together a hasty defense to prevent these two dorks from coming down into our backyard. And of course, you could probably figure out who at least one of the two dorks were.
I think so.
What was this, Dan? The late 80s?
Yeah.
88, 89, somewhere thereabouts?
Something like that.
Yeah. So we eventually became friends after, of course, the unpleasantness. We're both military families, so we moved away, and then we came back, and then we both moved back into the same houses because our parents hadn't sold the houses because, at least for us, when we left in really early 1990, Desert Storm kicked off and Fort Bragg emptied out, and so trying to rent a home here in the Fayetteville area was basically impossible. I assume, Dan, your parents were kind of in the same boat? Yeah. So fast forward a few years, we moved back into the same homes, and then, middle school age, and then just kind of picked up where we left off. Dan graduated a couple of years ahead of me in high school, so we stayed in touch while he was in basic training, and then he went off into the Army, and then I went off to college. And there were a few years where we kind of fell out of contact with each other, but then, as the internet started kind of getting up on its hind legs, we were able to reconnect. Dan was in my wedding. I mean, it's
cool.
My kids call him Uncle Dan. God help us.
Yes. They constantly ask me questions that they already asked their father, and they're blown away that I would have the same answer that their father does.
Can you believe it?
How dare you, Uncle? You're supposed to be the fun one.
Well, I am the fun one, but they don't realize that after 30 plus years, our brains are sort of melded together.
It's a little weird, I'm not gonna lie.
Yes, we tell the same dad jokes and give the same answers to foolish questions and things like that.
It's true.
But I am certainly the fun one. because I don't
Got
pay
it.
their dental bills.
That's true.
Well, yeah, you get the fun aspects of that. That makes sense.
Oh
Well,
yeah.
thank you for sharing a little bit more about that because I just kind of wanted to paint the whole picture because obviously you guys can tell you've known each other for a really long time and just how you interact and like you're saying of saying the same things and answering of the same aspects. I think that's cool. And honestly, I don't see many people have like longer friendships like that as much. So I'm always excited when I do
Yeah.
see people that know each
Yeah.
other so well.
We've known each other
We're
so long we finish each other's sandwiches.
sandwiches, yes. No, we are very fortunate in that regard. We have a group of friends that we have known by and large for 20 years or
Over
more.
20, yeah.
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 Some of them certainly back to our childhood, and some of them, from college or service or, family friends, whatever. And at least once a year, we get together and we go on a guys trip. And we go to a different place every year and just spend, 4 or 5 days just
It's all
hanging
about the
out,
food.
getting reacquainted. Yeah. It- we do have some amazing, amazing cooks in our group, but
It's
it's
just a
a it's a
weekend of food.
it's a good way to stay connected to people who, in some cases, live all the way across the country. In some cases, they live right here in town, personal schedules, work life, things like that. You don't get to see them but once every few months or so.
Yeah, our California friend we see as often as some of our friends that live, an hour up the road. So,
So,
yeah.
Oh, wow.
but making that conscious effort to stay connected has been very beneficial, very beneficial.
That's incredible. And honestly, listeners, that's a thing that you can turn back into a biblical thing of having community around you and back into talking about veterans and military, having people around you that understand and that aren't going to look at you like you're crazy when you're explaining different stories is always
Yeah.
beneficial in both aspects of faith and in being in military as much as, again, I've seen there because I don't ever want to act like I know what I'm talking about in that aspect. But I definitely think that this has been a very insightful conversation for
Right.
not only myself, but the listeners. And just, I think it's great to hear the background story of how Tracer Burnout came to be. And it's definitely, I think, nowhere near the finish of where you guys are going to be, and just adding all the different aspects of all of it, of what that could turn out in the next year, 2 years, however long it is, and building that and seeing the stories. And it, when Dan, when you were talking about having the stories of generations that might not be here any longer, it really just reminded me of having like a time capsule, and having that for the families, I think is really cool because it's just something that they'll always be able to hold on to regardless of how long the person has passed, or if they don't have a close relationship with them, they'll at least be like, oh, well, that was grandpa, or that was the uncle, or whoever it could be. And with that, listeners, I again hope that you got all of the insights, if or good laughs or anything in between. Well, we've had this great conversation, and I just wanted to close out with one more question for the guys. And where can people find you after our conversation?
Where can't they find us is a question. So of course we have tracerburnout.com. We're on most of the social medias. We refuse to start a TikTok page. That's mostly out of principle at this point. So we're on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. We do have an X slash Twitter presence. We're trying to build that one up a little bit. But if you want to get in contact with us, you can do it through any of those platforms. There's also on our actual website, tracerburnout.com, there's a contact us field. So if you fill that out, it'll email straight to our inbox, and we'll get it there too. So we appreciate anybody reaching out to us, and we're happy to give you a listen.
Yeah. You can download the episodes on, I don't even know how many podcast platforms there are now, but we are on all of them. So, I mean, from iHeart to Audible to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all the other ones that I can't even list off because I don't know them all, and it's constantly changing. But we're on all those. And then for the video version, you can go to YouTube or Rumble, and you can actually see the veterans and us. They want to see
Unfortunately, you can see us too. Yes.
our beautiful bald heads. But then you also get to see pictures of these service members during their time in.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing all of that. And listeners, again, I very much recommend you to reach out if you know anybody of military background that could be a good story, or just want to know more about either of the guys. As you can tell, they're pretty much open books and we'll share it with you. And I appreciate it. And again, thank you, both of you, for coming on and having this great conversation.
Of course, thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us. Yeah.
And just like that, we're at the end of another amazing episode. I first want to say a huge thank you to you, the listener, for tuning in and listening to what we have to say here on This Is Me Attitude podcast. I also want to say a huge thank you to each and every guest speaker that I've had on the show, that will be on the show, and to see this show really, really grow. I am beyond thankful about how many different amazing connections I've been able to have through this podcast, and each and every story has been absolutely amazing. So a huge thank you to all of the guest speakers. Also, the more we share this show, the more we share God's stories, the more people hear about it, and the more this gets out. If there's anything in today's episode that really stuck out to you, please go share it with a friend and tag us over on Instagram at This Is Me Attitude Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to the email list. This is the spot that you want to be. This is where I share all of the information of the podcast and anything else that could be added in the near future. I also give a free gift to each and every new subscriber. Lastly, if you have any prayer requests, I would absolutely love to pray for you. There is a Google form in the description below where you can throw your prayer requests in. Also, there is nothing that is attached to the name of the person giving the prayer request, so I will have no idea who I'm praying for, and the only person that hears these prayers is God himself. And that wraps up another great conversation. So until next time, never, ever, ever forget, God loves you.